results of their study, and then open it to questions by the media. When you do ask your questions, please come to the microphone so everybody can hear the question and can be recorded properly. We will start with, when we have an order for starting, first we will do Dr. Yusuf. Dr. Yusuf.
And we'll do my questions.
And we'll do your questions after you're done.
Thank you, Salim. Much appreciated. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. There are so many interesting things happening around. So just like the airlines say thank you, you have a choice. So thank you for flying with us, kind of thing. Now, how many of you have seen the Lancet paper that has come out? Just raise your hands. So some of you have, some of you haven't. Briefly, I want to tell you, there are three major strategies that the WHO, the World Heart Federation, are employing towards the conquest of cardiovascular disease. It is my fervent belief that 90% of premature cardiovascular disease can be prevented, and in the next 50 years will be prevented globally. And the three major strategies are smoking cessation, control of obesity, and the third one is to increase and maximize the use of proven, low-cost, effective, safe therapies worldwide. As part of this last strategy, the Polypill idea came about. In 2002, I wrote an editorial in The Lancet after the heart protection study was published, where I speculated about what I called a combination pill in secondary prevention, where we said if you add an ACE inhibitor, a beta blocker, aspirin, and a statin, we should be able to reduce the risk of major cardiovascular events by 75%. It was a theoretical statement in that editorial. In the subsequent year, Doctors Nick Wald and Malcolm Law from the UK wrote a series of elegant, careful, thoughtful meta-analyses where they expanded the concept not just to people with vascular disease, but they also said anybody over the age of 55 or 50 should be given a polypill, and the polypill would have 6 components. It would have 3 blood pressure lowering agents at half doses, an aspirin, a statin, and folic acid to reduce homocysteine. The reason they said everybody was practically everybody in the world today living in urban societies have risk factors for cardiovascular disease. We showed that in the INTERHEART study, where 99% of controls had risk factors. And so we needed a mass approach. The second reason they said 3 half doses of blood pressure lowering is because they felt it would be safe and effective. The homocysteine story hasn't panned out, but everything else has panned out. So about 4 to 5 years back, a group of us in India, in collaboration with the pharmaceutical company Cadila, embarked on a strategy, a developmental strategy. And as part of the developmental strategy, 3 studies were done in parallel. The first of these is what is being reported in The Lancet today. This is called the TIP study, done in 50 centers in India. It is the largest and only study of the polypill published thus far. It's a large phase 2 study, 2,053 people, randomized to 9 arms, and we tested 5 questions. First, can you actually create a polypill that people will take and is safe? Second, what is the safety if you have multiple ingredients? Does the side effects increase with each ingredient? So are the rates of discontinuation 5 times as worse in people who take the polypill with 5 drugs compared to somebody who only takes 1 drug? If you take people with normal blood pressure and give them 3 blood pressure lowering drugs, will their blood pressures fall in their boots and will they all collapse? So tolerability was a key thing. Finally, do you get the expected reduction in risk factors? Because Malcolm Law's and Nick Wald's paper was based on the existing data, so the blood pressure calculations they made were in hypertensive populations with a mean blood pressure of 155 systolic. That's not the blood pressure of you or me in this room. Similarly, their calculations on statins were based on data on high levels of cholesterol to start off with. What were our findings? First, we found that the polypill was very well tolerated. The study was a 12-week study, randomized, double-blind. The company were clever enough to make sure that the 9 pills in the 9 arms looked identical. And it's actually a capsule with a very clever formulation. And it showed that the side effect rate with 1 drug active, 2 drugs active, 3 drugs active, 4 drugs active, and 5 drugs active were identical. That was a surprise, a pleasant surprise. And the reason for that is the side effects of one drug tend to counteract the side effect of another drug. For instance, an ACE inhibitor increases potassium and increases creatinine. A thiazide does exactly the opposite. So, in fact, you get on hyperkalemia or in azotemia a lower rate when you combine it rather than when you give each one separately. So that was the first good news. The second good news was that 3 blood pressure lowering drugs reduced, compared to controls, systolic blood pressure by about 7.5 to 8 millimeters more, starting at normal blood pressures. So it does go down, but it doesn't go down as much as in hypertensive people. We estimated that the reduction in systolic blood pressure will lead to about a 1/4 reduction in heart attacks and a 1/3 reduction in strokes. Second, statins lowered lipids by about 25% in the Polypill and a little more, about 28% when simvastatin was given alone. These 2 numbers are significantly different, but clinically they're not different. When we put all the things together, we've estimated that the Polypill will likely reduce heart disease by about 60% and strokes by 50%. These numbers are substantially lower than the estimates made by Wald alone. Despite that, if we can halve cardiovascular disease by a single pill, if it's efficient and safe and tolerable, which it is, that is a huge step in the management of patients. So we believe this important step will lead to further development, further trials, but it could actually make a big difference to the way we treat people. I'll stop there.
We'll go ahead and take questions for Dr. Yusuf. Please come to the microphone if you can.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, who is this pill intended for, ideally? Is this the healthy person over 50, did you say?
First, it's definitely intended for people who would anyway take these drugs. So instead of taking 5 pills, putting it all into a single pill will do several things. It increases compliance. Second, it reduces costs, because the manufacturing cost is not 5 times more. It'll be more than 1 ingredient, but it won't be 5 times. The distribution, the marketing, the promotion cost will be less. And since we use proven therapies or proven molecules, but generic compounds, the cost will be less. So the benefits to the patient is better compliance. Benefit to the physician is you don't have to write 5 prescriptions. You write 1 prescription, polycap. And the third thing is low cost. These things are going to make a huge difference. But the bigger question is not people who already take it, and that's the implication of yours. Should high-risk people who not yet have heart disease take it? My guess is that's where the field will go to rapidly. But we need trials to show if we do it, we do reduce clinical events, and we and others are planning such trials. And my feeling is those trials will be in the field in 6 months to a year. The next question, if we are successful in taking moderate high-risk people without vascular disease and showing a benefit, is the original Wald hypothesis. Should you put it in the drinking water? That I don't know whether that will happen. But first one definite, second one likely, third one I don't know.
The people who are having this beneficial effect, are these people who, because I guess the premise was that these were people who, you said normotensive, I know the average LDL levels were not at levels that you would normally treat. So these are not people with hidden blood pressure or cholesterol risk factors who are getting picked up. These are just people with what are today considered to be normal levels. So does this mean you need to throw out JNC guidelines and ATP guidelines, and those are totally misplaced?
I think I'd answer your question. Increasingly, those of us in the field of epidemiology believe the concept of hypertension is wrong, the concept of elevated cholesterol is wrong. The higher your blood pressure, the greater the risk. The lower your blood pressure, the lower the risk. Same thing with cholesterol. So I think in 10 years we'll stop using the words hypertension, hypercholesterolemia. Should JNC and the others be thrown out? The answer is no. But should JNC and other national cholesterol education programs guidelines evolve? The answer is yes. But that's why every year or two the guidelines are reviewed, and my guess is over time these guidelines will incorporate new findings from new studies, including the Polypill.
Clearly there would have to be significantly more trials before we absolutely get in that direction. Yes, please.
In the Lancet paper, you seem to make an argument that in order to use a polypill broadly, you need at least this kind of phase 2 data, looking at interactions and surrogate endpoints. Why couldn't, now that we know that you can do this with these ingredients, why can't you just do some bioavailability studies and some safety studies? Why does the bar have to be set so high?
We decided to set the bar high.
Well,
Because
this is the first time. I'm wondering, doesn't that create a too high a barrier of entry for the next?
Look, this pill, even at an inexpensive generic cost, is going to generate hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue for whichever company or companies that have it. To invest a few $1 million to make sure that you have no hidden surprises and we are not doing something unexpected to people is just a worthwhile investment. And I think if companies try to take shortcuts, I'm not a regulator, so I'm not going to make the rules. I don't think you're a regulator and you won't make the rules. But what I would say is, isn't it reasonable to invest $5 million doing careful phase 2 studies? In fact, this study didn't cost $5 million. It cost, I don't know what it cost, but I can tell you it cost certainly under $1 million to do. That's peanuts for most of these companies. And to argue that we shouldn't do that to protect our patients is strange. I think most people will say we've had enough surprises in medicine. We better be sure before we give these drugs to millions of people.
I'm going to go on to the next question.
Hi, Aggie Peck with MedPage Today. So, Dr. Yusuf, the study, very interesting study in Lancet, but again, this theme of to the developing world, and one can certainly see that would be important. But I'm wondering if you can predict how this would be used in, say, in North America, in the United States, and in Canada. For example, one thing that comes to me immediately is that if we had a pill like this in the United States, we would save co-pays for a great many people, and particularly our Medicare patients.
Exactly.
So I'd like you to address that, please.
Yeah. I think the strategy of this has to be different depending on the economic and social circumstances of the society that you're going to market this. But this concept and this particular product is likely applicable worldwide. So I'm glad you recognize that this could be a big step in the developing countries. Most of you know 80% of cardiovascular disease is in developing countries. So thank you for that statement. But in a country like the United States, the cost of a pill depends on many factors. One factor is the cost of the raw ingredient. The same raw ingredient sold in the US at wholesale prices is 20 to 30-fold the same purity of raw ingredient in India. So if the US FDA says you have to use American raw ingredient, immediately your price is 30-fold higher. So these are value judgments society has to make. Second thing is willingness to pay. The likelihood is when this gets marketed in the United States, it will cost less than a Starbucks coffee. So you've got to ask yourself, a 55-year-old, a 60-year-old, would they be willing to sacrifice 1 cup of coffee to take something that will reduce the risk of their heart disease by 50%? I don't know which way it will go, but I do remember what Churchill said, Americans always do the right thing, but they experiment with the alternatives before that. So,
We're going to take one last comment here.
If you do have this done universally, then you're going to have some people whose systolic pressure is under 120, whose LDL is under 100.
Yes.
By any current concept of treatment, they're not candidates for these kinds of treatments. So this sounds like a real paradigm shift in the way medicine would use pharmaceuticals. Could you address that a bit, please?
yes, first, there's something inherently repulsive to most of us to say we're medicalizing the whole population. Fair enough. But just think of the millions of people in the world taking multivitamins with no evidence. And the more we know about multivitamins, like vitamin E, we now know it's harmful. Folates at high doses, other than in pregnant women, we know it may cause cancers. So lots of people take herbals, ginsengs, do all kinds of things. So the idea of taking a pill to improve your health is really not new. It is sort of embedded in most cultures, whether it is Asian, Western, whatever else. So that's one hurdle we have to overcome, but I see that being overcome, okay? The next thing, in fact, you ask the doctors at this meeting, how many of you are taking a statin? The majority of hands will go up. Yeah, so we're already there. The next thing is a paradigm shift. Absolutely right, it is a paradigm shift. But the paradigm shift has started at least a decade ago, where for blood pressure we've shown that what we call the normal range is really abnormal. For LDL, the Interheart study, if you remember figure 1, straight line over deciles of risk from lipids. Every 10% increase in lipids increase the risk by 20% with no threshold, which means 90% of people in the world have abnormal lipids. Third, we have just done some studies, and which is not yet published, where we looked at the risk factor level on the day of birth, and then in the first 5 years. How many of you can guess what the blood pressure on the day of birth is? Well, I shouldn't ask you, I'll tell you. It's 68 systolic, all right? And then by 3 years, it's 92 systolic. And your 3-year-old kid is running around like crazy, and you're tired running after them. So 92 may be the real, 90s may be the real blood pressure of a healthy individual, and the LDL is 0.7 at birth. And this is the time when the brain grows rapidly, and by the age of 3, it becomes 2.2. So we may be substantially revising what is normal within a very short time. And we've been doing studies in urban India and rural India. And in rural India, for instance, the mean BMI, not the lowest BMI, the mean BMI is 18. And their rates of diabetes is 2%. In urban India, it is mean BMI is 25, and their rates of diabetes is 27%. So what is normal will be substantially revised in the next 2 decades. Now the Polypill really is not attacking normal, it's attacking the question, the risk is continuous. I can go on this theme if any of you heard my various talks. My chair is...
We have one question,
Sure.
one last question that's coming from the telephone.
Yes, please. Thank you,
And
Hannah,
our
for
first
reminding
question
me.
will come from the line of John Fowler. Please proceed.
Hi, doctor. I just wanted to be clear on who this pill might be intended for. You're essentially saying that this would be a sort of a primary prevention medicine that would go to people who may have a risk factor but who don't have known heart disease. Is that correct?
I would say, for sure, the current results should be translated to people who have coronary disease or strokes or coronary equivalents. I think that is a given, it's an easy step. The next step is to do trials in people who don't have heart disease but have moderate risk, not high risk, but moderate risk, and that's will be launched in the next little while by several groups, and there'll be several trials. Our expectation and hope is that those results will support the need. If it doesn't, then matter ends there. I personally think at that stage, a large number of people today who are not treated by any of the current guidelines, which is average levels of, say, 2 risk factors, will be treated, and these may be people in their 50s or 55s or whatever. The big question, which I'm uncertain about, is whether you take the whole world at large over a certain age group, don't measure anything, and then give them all a polypill. That indeed has been proposed. I will withhold judgment whether that's the right thing to do or not right now. I will give you my opinion 5 or 10 years from now.
But that is one possibility, correct?
Absolutely. It is a possibility, and in fact it has been proposed by people. At the moment, I will reserve judgment. This is not a polite way of saying no. This is just a way of saying I really don't know that that's the right thing.
If I could just follow up with one thing. If that's the case, wouldn't this pill sort of encourage people to give up on what is necessary in terms of, for maintaining their heart health, exercising and watching their diet? Would this be sort of an excuse to just avoid
well,
those kinds of things?
I hope it isn't an excuse where McDonald's markets the polypill and puts it in along with their triple hamburger. I completely sympathize with your concern, and that this doesn't come in the same package as a package of cigarettes or a package for this thing. Lifestyle modification is the crux and the fundamental basis of cardiovascular prevention, because it not only prevents cardiovascular disease, it also probably prevents a large proportion of cancers. I better stop and run because I'm hogging time. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you, Dr. Yusuf. I just want to remind everyone that while I do share the enthusiasms of Dr. Yusuf, and that this trial was only 2,000 patients divided into 9 groups, small numbers. It's very encouraging, but the trials that will really eventually be pivotal in order to determine what patient population, and for that matter, whether anybody that's strong or otherwise will be treated with this pill, will be 20 to 30,000 patients, will be multinational, and will cost as much as $100 million to do. So,
None of that. It's only if you do it in the United States.
in the United States. Thank you, Dr. Yusuf.
Thank you.
Factors and outcomes is continuous and extends into what people often call the normal range. Average levels of risk factors are likely abnormal in practically everybody living in urban societies in the world, and the majority of heart disease come from people who have average risk factors. It has been hypothesized by several people, including myself, Richard Peto, Nick Wald, and Malcolm Law, and several others, that the polypill, if it's given to people over a certain age and at a certain risk, can reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. Some people have hypothesized that the benefits may be large and as much as 80%. However, there are many questions that needs to be addressed. Chiefly, can we formulate a single pill or capsule that can substantially reduce cardiovascular risk factors and is well tolerated, and do so in average risk people? There were 5 primary objectives of this last phase 3 trial. First is whether the polycap, which is a capsule, not a pill, is equivalent in reducing blood pressure when compared with its component, comparing 3 blood pressure lowering drugs. The drugs we used were hydrochlorothiazide, atenolol and ramipril, and they were used at low doses, and we wanted to find out whether aspirin, when added to it, attenuated the benefits. We also wanted to find out whether the effects of lowering heart rate would be similar with atenolol in the presence or absence of polypill. We wanted to look at whether there were interactions of the statin. We wanted to look at whether the effects of aspirin would be nullified by the other components. and most importantly, we wanted to find out safety, because there were concerns that 5 ingredients in a single pill will have 5 times more intolerability compared to a single or 2 or 3 or 4 ingredients. It was a randomized double-blind trial.